Hi everyone, and welcome to CU Cinefiles Remade, this show where we talk about movies and their prospective remakes. And today we're going to be talking about the two different versions of Suspiria, the 1977 Dario Argento film and the 2018 Luca Guadagnino film. So the 77 version runs at about an hour and a half, and the 2018 version runs at about 2.5 hours. So I think that gives you a good idea about what the two films are going for. In my opinion, the 77 version is incredibly concise. It's incredibly conceptual and very to the point, almost to the point where it feels incredibly fragile, as if the structure that Argento has developed, whether thematic or stylistic, could collapse pretty much at any point, but he manages to stave off that and create something that's really unique and incredibly special to horror fans, but also just to movie fans in general. The Guadagnino film, in contrast, it has a lot of hats on. It's trying to evoke a lot of different, not only styles, but also points of reference thematically for people to enter into. But it's much more expansive than the Argento version, and I think that presents some issues, but also some interesting points where the Guadagnino version might actually rise up and do something different, but equally as adept as the Argento version.
Yeah, I think they're both incredibly distinct. The 77 version, for me, is really focused on, at least as I see it, style. I mean, it's impossible to ignore, even if you just look at a still frame, the color, the visual aspect, but also the soundtrack by Goblin is just something that I honestly, especially during the month of October, get stuck in my head all the time. I just hear the witch in my head all the time, and once I get it there, it won't leave for days. And I think that's really what it is, because it is an in and out movie, like you said. Structurally, like, as soon as the ending happens, it's done. They don't do anything else. It's like, oh, Helena Marcos is dead. That's the movie. Yeah, good job, everybody. Wrap.
Which is completely different from what Guadagnino does, which is this extended multiple sequences after the fact, including an epilogue scene and an a mid credits scene.
And I think that what's interesting about them is they're both very stylistically rooted in the 70s, because the 77 version clearly is very giallo Italian 70s film, but I think especially if you look at it the way Guadagnino wants you to look at it, the 2018 version is very rooted in the German cinema of the 70s, the Fassbinders, the Wenders. There's so many of those 70s zooms that I just think of when I see, every time I see a movie with that in, I just go, why are they homaging the 70s? What's the point? But it's clear why they're doing it in this. It's really about the historical tumult of that time and how that manifested in those films and that stylistic tendency, and that's why it's included in the Guadagnino version. And so I think they're, as easy as it is to say, well, it's not as stylish because the color palette's much more muted and it's not really like doing all these things, I think it's just under the surface that you notice when you look a bit deeper, which is kind of the goal of the entire Guadagnino version.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned before, the Argento version is much more explicit in its stylistic goals, much more implicit in the messages that it wants to take away, from the film. The Guadagnino version is almost the exact opposite, where the stylistic components are very much muted, but still present. I mean, definitely in cinematography, but also the score by Radiohead frontman Tom York. But the kind of messages that Guadagnino wants you to take away are much more explicitly stated. And so I think if we go to the thematic side of the discussion with that film in mind first, we might be able to mine some more material out of Argento's, which is much more buried, but still present, I believe.
Yeah, so in terms of thematic narrative that is being told in Guadagnino's film. The screenwriter David Kajganich, he's talked at length about it in interviews, about it being a movie about the transition between women becoming empowered and men becoming disempowered. So the psychiatrist, the really only large male role in the movie, portrayed by a woman, Tilda Swinton, has never been empowering or used the power that he has as a man for good, or like a dominant member of society, because he loses his wife in the war. They kind of mention that. He does nothing to stop her being taken by the Nazis. He could have prevented it. He could have kept them together, but instead he stays silent. When he finds out about the cult, instead of acting or trying to stop it, he gathers all the evidence and throws it in the river. And he's this passive character who becomes a pitiful kind of failure towards the end, who's ravaged by guilt. Whereas the women build their power by recognizing their ability, perfecting their ability, and in the end of the film, organizing into a solid structure that has the ability to do something meaningful. And so that's why he said he wanted to set it in the Baader-Meinhof political environment, because it's the difference between being passive politically and going out and doing something violent and political to make a difference.
I think that's a very great series of insights. I think one of the reasons that I potentially didn't respond quite so positively to Guadagnino's version is one of the issues that I think the film poses is these kind of political quandaries, but there's a number of them, and some of them kind of fall off to the wayside. We obviously have the radio and television hijacking news that takes place throughout the film, which is kind of presented right up front, loses steam, but it's still present throughout the narrative, as well as the treatment of the female characters in the Covenant. In the Argento version, that aspect is kept somewhat in the dark until the kind of explosive finale, in which all those themes are kind of developed in full. The problem that I see with Guadagnino's version is that by stretching this kind of engagement with the cult out, we're putting more emphasis on them as, you know, individual characters, where, in my viewpoint, one of the major thematic points of the film is the idea of the enclosure of power and the isolation of these power systems and how they become corrupted over time, with the kind of references to Nazism and fascism within the Baader-Meinhof political era. And I think that by doing that, there's just this odd sense of Guadagnino wanting to do too much with the material, but also pushing these thematic points that were potentially present within the Argento film forward in a way that I don't think he realized that they were there. And so by making them so explicit, he kind of robs the film of a sense of mystery and a sense of otherworldliness that I think is present within the style of the first film.
Yeah, and I think that's, when you get down to the root of it, that is like Argento's main criticism of the movie. He says it lacks music and fear, and I think it's like symbolism, but basically he's referring to that. The stylish way, I don't want to say stylish because it's not the appropriate word, but the more
formalist,
layered aspect of it, instead of like, I think the Guadagnino version shows all its cards, but still trying to be mysterious and drive thinking from that, and it's a bit conflicted and a bit. I think that's why some critics called it pretentious, because it's a very mixed response in terms of critics. Some love it, some think it's pretentious waste of time, but I think it's because of Guadagnino's approach to the political aspect of it.
And I will give him credit. I mean, this is a film with potentially the most creative choices I've seen in a major studio release within the past couple of years, and I applaud him for doing that. I just don't think, personally for me, a lot of the aspects are well developed over the course of the film.
I would agree. I think ultimately I like the 77 version a little bit more than I like the Guadagnino version, but I would never toss it out. I think it's a good addition. It's a really good reinterpretation and it's definitely worth the watch.
For sure. Well, that was our discussion on the 2 different versions of Suspiria. If you have any thoughts about the film and our comments on it, please leave a message down below. And if you like the content you've seen on the channel, please consider liking the video and, of course, subscribing. Anyway, we'll be back within the next segment with another remake, and we hope to see you there soon. See ya.